I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. Our guest is Ray Moore, who, as a television commentator and news director, covered perhaps the most historical, political, and economic period in Georgia history. Welcome, Ray.
Thank you, Bob. Good to see you again after wandering around the state capitol and bumping into you here and there.
Yeah. Let's see now, Ray. From North Carolina to Ohio, then overseas in the Army, to Columbia University, and finally to Atlanta, Georgia.
Right.
Quite a journey.
It was indeed. I tell people I'm a hybrid, like corn, because I have a Southern mother and a Yankee father. And it was a good mixture somehow or other. He was a Marine in World War I. And I'll digress to say that once we were at a Cleveland Indians baseball game. And so they were playing the national anthem. And I'm just kind of built stupid, S-T-O-O-P-E-D. And I wasn't very erect for it. And old Daddy was ramrod straight. And then he cracked me in the rib and he said, "Stand up, this is the national anthem." So I stood up straight and got with it. So the Marine was still there.
Good.
And anyhow, about the North Carolina bit, I managed to be on the northeast coast of North Carolina at Elizabeth City. And then years and years later, I met the girl of my dreams who is from Asheville. So we cover the old North state, and she remembers more of the history of it than I do. But anyhow, my father walked in one day and announced to the family, "We are moving." And my Southern mother, popped her eyes out, and "We're moving." See, her family was all there in Elizabeth City. And so he says, "Yep." He said, "I bought an interest in a small newspaper in Ohio, and we're going." And so I'm age 13, and we take off. And I've told people subsequently that I rose from being a devil boy to, devil boy is pouring ink and all that stuff, more on the floor than in the wells, and to a reporter on the streets, and finally the editor because I was curious and aggressive and interested in things, and also my father owned the newspaper. So that's my progression as far as that's concerned. I worked 3 years there, tried to get a job with a Cleveland Plain dealer, but they said, this was during the war, they said, "When all the guys come home, you'll be out in the cold. You don't have a college education, so fry it." So I went back with that and chastened, and then the Army came along and drafted me. So anyhow, I went to got on the train, went rumbling through the train. We always had to take a side bar when the real freight stuff came through. And we got off in November in lovely pine scent and warmth, and I was just thrilled because we happened to be in what was then Fort Gordon, Georgia. That was my introduction to Georgia, the Peach State, and I was just glad to be here. And it was a great experience in Georgia, except for one incident that I'll recall for you. Am I going too long here in this part of it?
No, not at all.
I have to tell you about my experience in the Tennessee maneuver area. I was lying on the ground, of course, at night and came up with a bunch of chiggers. I counted 96 chiggers on one leg. And the guys had a relief for that, however. They said, you bathe in gasoline, and that'll kill them. Well, it'll kill them, but it almost killed me because I went into it stark naked out there in the wilderness and washing here in my private parts and the like. And I did an Indian war dance. It was just wild and crazy through the brush. So that's how I cured my chiggers and slept in a hammock the rest of the time in the Tennessee Maneuver area.
Then Columbia University.
Yes. I came back from the Army, and I went to Columbia because my red-headed girlfriend said they're teaching some courses at the Rockefeller Plaza by broadcast professionals. And I took one course in news commentary by Caesar Searchinger, of whom nobody ever remembers. And the other course was from Pat Kelly, who was the chief of staff of NBC announcers. And Pat told us one time about an incident he had with the Boulevard Watch Time. He said, because of the shortage of men, they brought in a lovely woman who had a great voice. And the first thing he had her do was to read a Boulevard Watch commercial. Boulevard Watch Time. And he got a call from the president of the Boulevard Watch Company. And he says, take that woman off my commercials. And Pat says, I beg your pardon? He says, I'm not going to have a woman reading my commercials. And Pat says, well, listen, what if she does well and other people accept her? He said, I'll tell you when I'll have her doing my commercials, and that is when they have a soprano singing the Toreador song, Carmen. But Pauline Frederick was a great gal. And then come WSB, and we hired women there, and one of them became a state senator who was my secretary, and another secretary is now the editor of Seasons magazine. Her name then was Gloria Crow, and I've forgotten what her name is now, but she has been a marvelous addition to the Seasons crowd and high society in Atlanta. Now, how did I get to WSB? Well,
before we do that, let's talk about your first job.
Okay, yeah, first job. Johnson City, Tennessee. I got out of college, and I knew I wasn't right for New York television or radio at the time. It was all radio then. And I said, well, if I take auditions in New York, even though I'm lousy, I'll probably have a chance to get over my buck fever and do better. So I wrote all 4 stations, including the PBS there, and I got only one invitation answer from WOR. And the guy brought us in for an audition, and I read, I must not have gotten through a minute, and he says, okay, son, he said, that's all we need. And I said, well, what's the matter? He said, tell me what. He said, well, come here with me. He put his arm around my shoulder and led me down the hall. And here's Bud Collyer doing a great wild woman show. And so he says, now, your voice just lies in the mud. Somebody has told you that announcers have deep voices, and you're forcing yours there. He said, but Bud Collyer grabs people by the ear. They're competing with a dishwasher and a laundry machine and all the rest of that stuff, and they've got to be attracted and grabbed by the ear, and they ain't gonna grab you by the ear. He said, I would advise you to try to get another profession. So anyhow, in Broadcast Magazine, I found an ad for Johnson City, Tennessee, and I got an invitation to go there, which I did on my last few bucks. If I had been rejected there, God help me, I'd have been out of, well, I had my parents' home I could stay in. But anyhow, I go down there, and as a very engaging station manager at the time, and I guess one of the reasons he was engaging was that he was a drunkard. I didn't find that out until sometime later when they caught him sitting in a movie show watching the movie when he should have been out selling commercials. Anyhow, that was my beginning there. And let's see if I have any other stories, wild and crazy, about Johnson City. Well, that's about it. When I'm in Johnson City, at night I used to listen to the late night newscast and the dance programs, you know, all canned. And I ran across WSB Radio in Johnson City at night, and there was a nice guy named Bob Watson there who was the head of the Platter Party, and he was easy and friendly and all that, and he used to invite in Jerry Vandeventer on Friday nights because Jerry was the music librarian. And so I said, those seem like nice guys. I wonder if I could work there. So I looked in Broadcast Magazine and I see a name, Mark Bartlett. Mark is the program director at the time. And I wrote a letter to him and he said, send me an audition disc. I sent him it and recommendations. And so I sent him all that. And so he said, okay. He says, we don't have an opening now, but he said, if you're ever passing through Atlanta, I would be glad to talk to you. I got the letter on a Monday, and Monday night I was passing through Atlanta, tried to get a room at the Biltmore, but couldn't do that. So I went downtown somewhere. I've forgotten where now, but anyhow, I came in the next day and talked with Mark, and he said, well, we do have an opening. Bill Hale has just moved to television, and he said, we got a position in radio for you, doing station breaks. So in the station break business, I was great, except for one vast omission. What it was not football. What it was you got a half-minute station break, and then you say your call letters, and then you let go a 20-second spot, and then you say the call letters and goodbye. Well, I punched the button and I said, WSM Atlanta, and uproar. And the engineer says to me on the earphone, hey, you said WSM. I said, I did? He said, yes. So I had just 2 seconds before we went back to network, and I said, WSM Atlanta twice. They call him and said, somebody tell that guy where he is, will you?
Let me ask you this question, and I'm just curious.
Yes.
You came from a newspaper background.
Yes.
Why did you choose radio?
Well, I hammed it up, I guess. I was in Little Theater in Johnson City, and I did a couple of pro bono broadcast things for the town itself of Orrville, Ohio. And by the way, nobody's ever heard of Orrville, except I tell them, you ever heard of Smucker's strawberry preserves? Oh, yes. I said, well, look on the label. It says Orrville, Ohio. And I said, I am so old that I knew old man J.M. Smucker himself. So anyhow, that's Orrville. And I did some, broadcasting there at things that they were doing in town and things like that, and I got the bug. I had to unlearn some of my newspaper habits when I got on radio, though. I became enamored of, a guy who wrote the AP and all the guys like Edward R. Morrow and the like. And the idea was subject, verb, object. And it's direct speech. and you don't go off into tangent and wander around. It's just wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. And so I learned from that, and I used to always give my interns that particular book. And I wish I could remember the name of it now. But anyhow, they learned and I learned from that.
Is it true that when you were in Johnson City that you created a children's program called Follow the Funnies?
Well, you know, I think that was Marcus Bartlett who was Follow the Funnies. I might have done something like that, but one of the things I did in Johnson City that I still remember with pleasure was the Hillbilly Hit Parade. Nowadays it's country music, you know, but June Carter Cash will say it was hillbilly. It was country when I was. Anyhow, I was Tex, and I had a horse named George who could do very little except speak. And I had a girlfriend named Calamity Jane, and the villain of the piece was Cactus Jack. And I created these characters and carried on just wonderfully for about a couple of hours, playing and singing along with Mother's Not Dead, She's Only a Sleeping. Neath that cold gray tomb of stone. I remember, it's just wonderful, dolorous things. And so I went from hillbilly, at 3 o'clock it was high school jump music, and at 6 o'clock it was music of the masters. We were up snorting then. Anyhow, it was a gamut and a great training ground.
Now to WSB.
Yes.
You got your job.
Yes.
You were a staff announcer.
Right.
What happened after that?
Well, I'm trying to think about how it worked out there. Oh, I know what it was. Bill Hale got another job, and I came out to replace Bill Hale again. And I was a staff announcer at WSB-TV. And I waited until I had my chance to get on the air instead of behind the camera, because as I told you, I was a ham. And so finally I got my chance on Byerly's fruit-flavored soft drinks, non-carbonated beverage. And Taylor Lumpkin, who was the producer, and I concocted a lot of crazy and wild commercials for them, a desert island, you know, and all that stuff with Byerly's saving my life. But I thought that when I got on camera, I'd be cool and confidential, as Dizzy Dean used to say. But I got on the air, and the red light went on, and all of a sudden, the room didn't have much air in it. So where'd the air go? I could hardly breathe. So, but I got through it, and I muddled through the whole thing, and we had a good time with it. And that was my breakthrough there.
A lot of people, Ray, won't remember this, but I do.
Yes.
Television was really in its pioneer days back then. Nothing like it is today.
That's right.
And the commercials were all live.
Yep.
You could make mistakes, like you could easily goof up a commercial. There's one in particular about hot dogs.
The Great Hot Dog Incident, we call it. Again, it was live television, about 11 o'clock at night, and I come on the air, and it's for Swift's Premium Frankfurters. And so I get on the air, and what you do is you hold up the package of hot dogs while you're extolling the virtues of the same. And all of a sudden I see Hugh Fraser, the prop man, grab the top of his head and spiral to the floor. He's off camera, and I'm still on camera. What have I done wrong? Did I say the wrong thing? And they said, at the close of the commercial, I said, Hugh, get up off the floor and tell me what I did wrong. He says, look at what you're holding. And it's White's Cornfield Wieners. The Great Hot Dog Incident.
Did that result in a make good?
I'm sure it did. I don't remember that, but make goods, as the radio audience might know, is when you goof up something, you get another crack at it later on in the programs.
Frozen pot pies.
Oh, yes. Oh, my gosh. Well, Jesse Jewell was a big thing in Atlanta during those days. And he put out a little Jesse Jewell frozen chicken pie. It was about that big, and it was in an aluminum tin with all kinds of colors of the aluminum. And so I had to do it on TV. And so the camera goes on, and I say, underneath this tender, flaky crust is a complete one-dish meal. And I stop it with a fork, and it goes, like that. So I'm looking here, and I realize it's still frozen. Hugh Fraser did me up. Hugh had not thawed the chicken. Anyhow, that's what put Jesse Jewell out of business, I think.
Well, television newscasts in that day were not as long as they are today, and really didn't go into all the depth that they do today.
That's right, yes.
Describe for us a typical news broadcast in the 1950s.
Well, it was all part of a 15-minute segment. We had 10 minutes of local news interspersed with commercials, which rattled it down to probably 6 or 7 minutes, and then 5 minutes of weather, and then 15 minutes of the network news. And incidentally, Doug Edwards was doing that particular CBS News at that time, and Mark had told me when I was hired, he said, Ray, if you're worthy of it and want to go to network, we'll support you, like we did Doug Edwards. And they helped him get a job on the network. Mm-hmm. So I thought about that later several times, but I'll not get ahead of myself. Anyhow, it was a very short snort. We didn't have to do much writing or anything like that, but it was on a teleprompter, which frequently went awry. And I don't know how President Obama gets by with it. They must rehearse it many times, because I don't know what he'd do if he were without the teleprompter.
How did you get from being a staff announcer into news?
Well, I wanted to be in the news area, and so they needed somebody to do the newscasting, and they put the finger on me for it, and that was fine. I had done the weather, 5 minutes of weather, and I horsed around with that, had a great time with it. Clowned around is a more exact word for it. And I was doing this newscast, and Marcus Bartlett called me to his office. He said, Ray, he said, Shell Oil is sponsoring the news now, coming up. He says, but the owner of Shell Oil sent the word down that he didn't want that clown doing his newscast. And so I was shocked, and I walked away from that, and I said, maybe I better do things differently. So I greatly tempered my delivery and everything like that. I guess patterning something out after Dave Galloway. He was my mark at that particular time. And so I survived in that respect, and the clown got to do the news at noon, muchly subdued clown.
But you were a weatherman.
Yes, I was.
And were you a meteorologist?
No. Nowadays, you got to have a meteorology degree, and I don't understand how in the world Glenn Burns, for example, does it with all the computer stuff, and they click here and they click there, and all that stuff is absolutely marvelous the way they do it now. But mine was like they do in the classroom. you had a cloud burst here, and you had a felt thing to hold it onto a felt background. And it kept dropping off, and I had to make alibis about that and things like that. So we got through it. We got through it somehow, and I would dream up things about the weather when I got mail, which was my real ambition. And once upon a time, I got a mail that says, "Dear Mr. Moore, years ago, when the Lord handled the weather situation, it was generally understood." He says, "But since He turned it over to you, it's messed up all the time. It makes me sick. Hoping you are the same. I remain sincerely yours," etc., etc. And so I read the letter on the air, and I said, "Frank," I said, "it may be a comfort to you to know that the Lord is still calling the signals for the weather game. The trouble is, I can't find the huddle."
Don McClellan tells a story about you using an analogy one time of water and how it goes around your drain.
Oh, yes, right.
Did you do that?
I did that. I got to refresh my memory on this momentarily here. It's kind of worn out after 90 years. Okay, so I was doing the weather, and I explained to them that this is L stands for low pressure center, and the weather circulates in a counterclockwise direction around a low center. I said, but here's a high center, and the weather circulates in a clockwise direction. I says, but if you go south to, say, Rio de Janeiro, the weather will circulate differently, exactly around a low. It's that way. And I also said, you'll notice that the water in your bathtub will drain in a counterclockwise direction if you are north of the equator. But south of the equator, it will drain in a clockwise direction. So I get this letter. Dear Mr. Moore, the water in my bathtub drains in a clockwise direction. Please tell me, am I further south than I think I am? Oh God, there's another port there. Farther south than I think I am. Anyhow, I can't remember the second line. But anyhow, I read the letter on the air, and I said, it was, God, I almost said his name there. Anyhow, I said, "Dear Bertrand," or whatever his name was, and then I explained the water will circulate in a narrow area, whichever way it wants to go in your sink. But if you have a bathtub as big as Lake Okeechobee, it will circulate in a counterclockwise direction.
That's funny. Okay, you're in the news now, then you become news director.
Yes.
And you had to build a staff.
Yes. Good. Don Heald was the news director, and he was promoted to general manager of WSB-TV, so that left a hole for me to step into the news director's job. And we were fortunate because we got resumes from all over the nation because they were anxious to be on WSB, which was the crown city of the Southeast and one of the best. NBC told us probably the best in their nation of all their affiliates. So we dragged them in, and also the resumes came in. And I was so proud that we had the people that we had. We didn't pay them much. John Pruitt, whom I hired, says, "Ray, you hired me at $1.50 an hour." And I said, "John, don't feel bad. I was making $1.75 an hour." the Cox were not famous for paying great salaries. In any case, the thing that I remember was Frank Gaither, who was the vice president, put an ad in Broadcast Magazine. Broadcast Magazine was kind of the Bible of the broadcast industry. So the ad read this. Oh, I must say, this was in the day when telegrams used the word stop for a period. And he said, "Dear NBC, we sent you Fred Briggs, stop. We sent you Tom Brokaw, stop. We sent you George Page, stop. We sent you Dave Riggs, please stop." And in any case, that was inspiration of Frank Gaither, who was a creative guy.
It was a great compliment to the station also.
Oh yeah, boy, we had a really wonderful staff.
Mm-hmm.
George Page, who eventually graduated to NBC and Vietnam coverage. I used to worry about him ducking when those shells came over in Vietnam, and he eventually was the host of Nature program. And Kennedy Jones, of course, is retired in Atlanta. And you know what happened to Tom Brokaw. By the way, I almost didn't hire Tom. Almost didn't hire Tom Brokaw, if you can believe it. We got a video from Tom Brokaw, which Don McClellan was the screener. He was, if you got past Don McClellan, then you'd get into me. And so Don brought this guy and he said, "Look this fellow over." And I looked at him. He was handsome, good voice, and reasonably good background in news and stuff like that. And then I heard it. It was a glottal stop. And it's still, by the way, visible. His L's are not quite the way they need to be. And there used to be jokes made about that by some unfeeling people. But I said, "No, that great guy, you know, trouble with speech impediment." So I said, "I'm trying an experiment." I took the video into the broadcast room, and I called in 3 secretaries. And I said, "Listen to this guy." And he listened to him and said, "Oh, he's lovely, hire him." And I says, "Well, what about his speech? Do you hear anything?" "No, we don't hire anything. We don't hear anything. Hire him." So I finally decided that if they couldn't hear it, then the general public will not hear it. And that was the good part. And thank God we hired him. He was only with us a little more than a year. I made the mistake of, I resigned from doing the NBC feeds, which I did on average of once a week during the 1960 civil rights. So I got tired of that, and Hal and Tom Brokaw were farmed out to do those NBC feeds in parts of Georgia that were frothing. And Tom did one, and I got a call from Tom Pettit, who was in Los Angeles. And he said, "Ray, would you mind if I talk to Tom Brokaw?" And I said, "No, Tom, go ahead and do it." And I remembered what Mark Spartlett had said. Mark is, you know, helping people up. And I said, don't want to stand in his way. If they like him, they can hire him. And sure enough, they did. They gave him about twice the salary he was making for us. Mm-hmm. And he went out to L.A. and took the town by storm, got an hour-long newscast there, and eventually White House news correspondent, and onward and upward with Lydia E. Pinkham. So,
well, as news director, I'm sure it was essential that you monitor at least politics and government. How did you go about that? What were you looking for?
Well, in politics, is that what you're saying? Mm-hmm. Well, I was looking for interesting stories that would affect Georgians. Right now, I'll confess I don't watch much local news because it's rape and incest and murder and all the rest of it, and I get tired of that. So what I was looking for then, however, mainly was legislative stories and civil rights stories. We were plagued by civil rights. It was a problem then, and it's a problem now. We will never, ever, in my career and beyond, get out of the question of civil rights and the black versus white arguments. I thought we had a pretty good relationship back then. I thought that. They didn't think that, but I did. And I feel now that it has deteriorated, and there's a lot more animosity and the like than it was then. But we had a lot of civil rights agitation, and of course that involved Dr. Martin Luther King. And he was so articulate, such a great speech maker. You could put him on a podium with Barack Obama, and they would come off almost equal as orators. He was mesmerizing. And of course, the I Have a Dream speech and all the rest that we're familiar with. But the people fumed at him, and they said, "You got no business putting that on the air. Take him off the air. You're just agitating. You're causing trouble by giving him airtime." Well, when he was finally assassinated, parentheses, before that, when President Kennedy was assassinated, the whole town was looking for Dr. King. Nobody could find him. They'd call his office, and his secretary, Dora McDonald, would, I don't know where he is, you know. And so I grabbed a cameraman and got in the car. We went to the SCLC headquarters. Very dark at night. It was nightfall. It's being November, I believe. Anyhow, it was November 22nd. I remember now. It was dark, and so I rapped on the glass, and nothing happened. I rapped on the glass again, and I kept on rapping on the glass until finally, down the corridor, I see a door open with a light behind it, and a shadowy figure marches up through to the front door. It's Ed Clayton, who was the editor of the Atlanta Voice, which was a prominent civil rights newspaper. And he opened the door, and I told him we were looking for Dr. King. And he recognized me, and he said, "Wait here." So I waited there, and he goes wandering back, all his shadow, and then out comes the light, comes two guys, one of whom is Dr. King. And Dr. King was kind enough to sit down in the vestibule there, and I talked to him, and one of the things, I don't remember the exact words I said, but when President Kennedy is assassinated, how much of a target are you? Are you not nervous and afraid because you know you might be next? And he said, "No." He says, "I've been in this business long enough now that I know that I can't control things like that, and I am ready." And he was as brave and courageous as I've seen. He really was. Mm-hmm. So anyhow, the other time was when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and they were looking for a white Mustang. And all over they wanted a white Mustang because they thought that the killer had gotten away in a white Mustang. So I got a call one day from a lady who lived in Capitol Homes, Manus. And so she said, "Ray," she said, "there's been a white Mustang parked in our parking lot at Capitol Homes a long time." Lorene Manus. Thank God I got her name finally came in. And I had taught her child in Sunday school at Trinity Methodist Church, which was an inner city church right in the middle of the state capitol. Anyhow, that was my, I think, benefit of contacts. A news person lives on contacts. And she called me, "It's a white Mustang?" I said, "Hold everything." Got a cameraman, ran down there, and we didn't touch the thing, but we got all kinds of film of it and an interview with Lorene and the like about the white Mustang. Then I called the FBI, and they shuffled on down there right quick. And sure enough, it was the car that James Earl Ray had gotten in and gotten away. And Lorene had seen him get out of the car and walk away toward the center of the state capitol. And so she was right on the ball there, and we got the scoop on that. But again, momentary pause, station break. So the real eye-opener for me was when in that little Ebenezer Baptist church, you had the leaders of the country, and from a near and from afar. And the fact that one man could draw that high and mighty bunch is remarkable of itself. And then came the funeral, which to me was a climax, with a mule-drawn cart and the like. And I did a piece on the air, and I wish I could remember the details of it, but it said something like, all night long, the telephone jangled with threats of, "Okay, white boy, now you're going to die like Dr. King did, and we got him, and now we're going to get you, and you guys have been pumping him up, and you'd think he was Christ, but he wasn't." And so the piece I did had something to do with that, because on that Sunday morning, after the gloom and doom of the funeral, the sun was bright and shiny, and the parade wound through downtown Atlanta, and it was a gripping, immortal feeling to watch that thing unfold and to know that there was life and love and brightness in the world, overcoming the darkness. And I think that was the lesson from the funeral of Dr. King.
You did several documentaries during that period.
Yes.
You care to share them with us?
Yes. The fact that in 1954, there was the ruling that the school had to be desegregated. And we put it off as long as we could. And it's interesting to me now, this is a sidebar, that the Democrats, Richard Russell and Herman and all the rest, were fighting tooth and nail against desegregation for the Democratic Party. And now, where are we? Democrats, they've forgotten that it was the Republicans who were agitating in their favor. Anyhow, that's a sidebar. So let's see, where was I headed when I got off track there?
Some of your documentaries.
Documentaries. Atlanta was faced with this, and I knew we were going to have a lot of trouble. So New Orleans was one of the first to desegregate. And I knew Bill Monroe of WSU, New Orleans, who eventually became moderator of Meet the Press. And I got permission from him to come down to WDSU and film the goings-on in New Orleans. And there was a mean, vituperative crowd in there. And They used the word freely of nigger and all the rest, and threatening even little children that walked to school. And one white mother, I remember, was brave enough to send her to a school during the frothy, threatening times that we faced in that desegregation thing. And I interviewed her and asked her how she was brave enough to risk walking down that mob, walking in front of them, and with them hurling epithets at her. And she said, we felt our child needed an education, and that's how we should go. So that was, and then we followed up with the way segregation should be handled properly, and that was Charlotte. They were moderate, they were well controlled and the like, and they presented the good side as opposed to WDSU in New Orleans, which had the bad side. And then came our turn. And how were we going to cover it? We had, as I recall it, 4 different black children who had been carefully selected, going to 4 different high schools. So we plotted it out. In those days, it took time to develop film. Right now, a videotape is, well, just like that. But that day, we had to take it down, back to the station, process it slow as it could be, and then put it on the air. So we plotted it out so that we took a minimum of film and brought it back to the station so that we could meld it and then make pieces of it for the news. And thereby we got the news, and I think got a beat on the competition. They are good people at WAGA-TV, and Paul Shields and I became the best of friends. He was a news director there when I was news director at WSB. In any case, we did pretty well with that. And the next day, they put me on with the guy that I was going to succeed. John Chancellor was the MC of the Today Show. Takes me a little while for the cogs to turn. Sometimes they turn. Anyhow, John interviewed me about the school situation in Atlanta. And I said a lot of it is due to the planning of Mayor Hartsfield, who assigned police at each one, and he wasn't going to tolerate no dissent. And he saw to it that the children were protected, that the crowd was orderly. They had to get back a certain way. In fact, we couldn't get our cameras in very close either. So Willie B. took care of that for us. And that reminds me of subsequently Georgia Tech desegregated after UGA, and the president of Georgia Tech at the time laid down the law. You march, you agitate, you're gone. But that gets me around to UGA. Are we ready for that?
I think now's a good time.
Okay. We had Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes, 2 very good-looking, very bright, very hand-picked students. I think Don Hollowell, the lawyer, had something to do with bringing them out and picking them out. And
Horace Ward.
Horace Ward, yeah, who was a graduate student, I think, at the UGA. He eventually became a graduate law student there, in any case. So anyhow, they marched in, and over, again, the obscene threats and the like, we interviewed people afterward, and they were equally tenacious. And I thought to myself, I'd like to find one of the kids who was especially threatening that we interviewed on camera. Dick Goss did some of those interviews, and how menacing he was about what was going to happen to those children. And they weren't, no hand was laid on them, but they were ostracized. Hamilton lived off campus, so he was safer. But Charlene lived in Myers' dorm, as I recall it. And so the children in the dorm would get above the room above hers and stomp on the floor at night, trying to jar her. And there were people outside who would throw rocks against the glass there, and she had to duck some flying glass on occasion. Kept her head high going to class and walked right through them. But then came the denouement, when the Georgia and Georgia Tech basketball teams were playing. And we had all sorts of tips that there was going to be a conflagration at the campus that night after the basketball game. So the night before, Dick Goss had been our cameraman, and a rock had caught him in the chest, and he had dropped his camera, and they ran off with it. It was a $1,200 Bell & Howell camera, which isn't much nowadays, but it meant something to our news budget. Anyhow, it was gone. And so that was the night before. So I decided I couldn't send one of our guys out without going myself. So I led the charge. I got a great big Bell & Howell with 400-foot reel on it. Not Bell & Howell. It was, anyhow, 400-foot camera, sound camera. And a lot of good that did me. We came, I walked through the basketball gymnasium, and I got all kinds of threats. You better get that camera away, you better not come out. And so I came out anyhow. But while I was standing on the lawn in front of the Myers Hall, I saw the fire trucks come up and a steady drumbeat of rocks that the kids were picking up and throwing them against the fire department vehicles. And then they began to rain into the lawn where we were. And like Dick Goss, I caught one in the chest. I had a very thick coat on at the time because it was cold out that night, and I was smart to wear the heavy overcoat and caught it without any real damage. But then I would have to confess to you that I did not turn on the bat light. The bat light is a headlight, in effect, that shines on the subject that you're trying to film. And I was too smart to turn that on, too chicken, I guess you would say. So that remained quiet, and I don't think we got any film that was any good all night. But the next thing I know, there are about 10 or 12 kids moving in on me. Get that camera, closer and closer. And John Furman, who eventually became a lawyer for Cox Broadcasting, was a student in journalism, and he and another young man, I think his first name was Steve, I can't remember his last name, interposed themselves between me and the mob. Said, he's a good guy, he's not going to do any harm, take it easy on him, you know. And about that time, thank God, the mayor or the chief of police let go with the tear gas, and we excavated right quick into Charlene's dormitory. So the tear gas saved us. I don't know what would have happened to us otherwise. Mm-hmm. I would also interject something that I might have forgotten, and that is that we called Governor Vanderbilt's office that afternoon and said, you know, there's going to be trouble tonight. You probably need to stay patrol on hand. So here we have this kerfluffle on the campus and no state police. Only the Athens police were there. Mm-hmm. And only after calm had been restored did the state police roll up. And I have just really had a time with that, reconciling that with the decision. I love Governor Vanner. He was a great guy. We had a panel discussion on one of the anniversaries of Charlene when she was there, and I paid my respects to him, and he had a tough decision, a tough decision. And I think given the circumstances, he may well have done the correct thing.
Let's talk for a minute about him.
Yes.
He had run on a platform of absolutely no school integration. But then the 54 decision changed that.
Yes.
Because it was no longer a question of whether there would be school desegregation. There was a question about when.
That's exactly right.
So he'd made the promise, no, not one, and yet he realized that it was now the law and that he had to obey.
Exactly right. And a tough decision, as I say, for him. But he did the right thing. We had, part of our documentary about Atlanta was we call it the last school bell. And the idea was, if you close the public schools, as Herman Talmadge and others were threatening to do at the time, what have you got left? You've got private schools. And we went to a lot of the embryonic private schools around and filmed them, and it was pitiful. They had no standards and frequently no textbooks and the like, and that's what Georgia would have reflected if they had indeed closed the public schools at the time. So anyhow, it was not done, and Governor Vanderbilt deserves great credit for his guts in calling that shot.
Mm-hmm. Well, he formed the commission to let the people speak. As I recall, it was the Sibley Commission.
The Sibley Commission, that's right.
Did you cover those meetings?
Well, Joe Fain, who was our lone cameraman at that time, to cover all of Georgia, I sent him at every meeting of the Sibley Commission. Judge Sibley was such a marvelous portrait of a judge. He was large, and he was dignified, and he was not, what am I trying to say? He was not aggressive, but he simply listened, and his commission listened. And as I say, Joe went to every one of those, and we broadcast them on television. I don't think any other TV station in the area covered them, but we did it. And I think that was a calming effect. That was a brilliant stroke by the governor. Mm-hmm. And the fact that he chose Judge Sibley was the right man for the job. Mm-hmm. I think that helped us greatly in ameliorating the problem, because the people out there were then faced, when he asked, if we don't have public schools, what do you want? And they had to face a decision, yes, no, or what? And that brought them face to face with the decision making.
Mm-hmm. Good. Jimmy Carter said that was one of the most courageous political decisions that was ever made by a Georgia governor, incidentally. Speaking of Vander, let's go back. In the very beginning, I said that you covered the most historical, political, and economic period in Georgia history. Let's talk about some of the events that transformed Georgia from the dark ages into the vibrant state it is today. I think you would agree that probably the first was the county unit system being destroyed by the Supreme Court.
Yes, yes. The county unit system, of course, was the way that Roy Harris, who was an Augusta politician and a wonderful, fiery speechmaker who was all segregationist, he and his buddies had engineered the county unit system, which, of course, gave Fulton County, as I recall it, 6 votes, and every other little county, Grady County and all the rest, had 2 votes in the legislature. And you can imagine how they would gang up on Atlanta. And of course, the situation is reversed now, but they would vote the way Hummon wanted them to vote, and Gene as well. And I must tell you a Gene Talmadge story. And this was in the early 1960s. Oliver Healy was one of our producers, and Oliver was covering the stump speeches around Georgia. And Gene Talmadge was sitting there waiting for this guy to finish his speech, and the crowd was tepid, I should say, more than anything else. And so Gene nudges Oliver and says, "Wait till I get up there." And so Gene gets up there, and man, he starts talking about them lying it down in newspapers, the fish wrapper, as he called it, and the N-word and all the rest of it going out there. And he got the crowd stomping and hollering and jumping up and down. He knew what he was doing, yes. And it's unfortunate that he did. But Gene was awfully smart, and so was his boy Herman. From afar up in Tennessee, when I was watching the hearings that were taking place about Watergate or whatever, I was interested that Herman was on the panel. And I thought maybe he would be prejudiced or whatever, but he was the one who asked short, simple, penetrating questions and zeroed in on the problem while Baker and some of the rest of them were orating. And Herman pulled it through. Mm-hmm. And I got a respect for him at that time that I hadn't had before. Mm-hmm. And of course, when I saw him in Atlanta later on, I still found that he was an extraordinarily intelligent man. And one of my Herman stories is that I had brought him in for an interview after he was governor. And everybody knew he was going to run for the U.S. Senate, but he wouldn't admit it. He was campaigning and doing all that stuff. No, I was not going to say. So I got him face to face with an interview on camera, and I says, Governor Talmadge, is it true or is not true that you're going to run for the U.S. Senate? Well, wait, said, I don't anymore know whether I'm going to run for the U.S. Senate than you know what you're going to have for breakfast tomorrow morning. And I said, well, Governor, I'm going to have fried eggs and milk and bacon because I have that every morning. And I'll have it then. So anyhow, we had a good time. But he never, I didn't get him to admit it, obviously not.
Getting back to those political developments, the county unit system, of course,
yes.
equalized voting strength in the state.
Yes.
Secondly, the decision to redistrict and one man, one vote made every person's vote count the same.
Yes.
And that was the opening of real progress in political history in Georgia.
Yes. And it's still going on, Bob. Whoever's in office says who represents what. They carve up the districts so that they get their boys in office doing the voting and all that stuff. So the Republicans are in charge now, but the Democrats will be in charge then. It was almost exclusively a Democratic operation in the state legislature in those days. And the governor was Democratic, and the legislature would rubber stamp whatever he wanted, and he had his henchmen in there, and they would report to him and get their marching orders and carry them out. So anyhow, that's right. they're redistricting, and it keeps on keeping on.
At that time, Birmingham and Atlanta were sort of rivals, both about the same. Atlanta was able to forge out front and become the model city that it is because of our response to the civil rights activities. Is that safe to say?
I think that's certainly a strong part of it, Bob. One of the things, of course, is the foresight of Mayor Ivan Allen and Willie B. Hartsfield, I should say, because Mayor Hartsfield was the man who saw that we'd take this scrubby old field out there, Candler Park or whatever we called it, I forget, and we'd make a big airport of that, bigger and bigger and bigger, and that forged us as the leader because Dr. William Holmes Borders, who was a great black preacher, used to say, "You can't go anywhere in the U.S. unless you go through Atlanta." And that's what Hartsfield had fashioned and that Mayor Allen had aggrandized. So that, I think, was one of the reasons that in Birmingham got eclipsed. That plus the fact that in Birmingham they had the police dogs and they had the confrontations with the chief of police and all the rest of the stuff. And I was going to say something else in that particular vein, but let's see. That gave a black eye to Alabama, unquestionably, and it was broadcast all over everywhere. And I'm thinking of the guy who was a CBS cameraman. He had that bell and howl in hand, and he needed it because if the menacing crowd got too close to him, he'd wave that bell and howl like a stick. And they did get to the camera people. It was a threatening environment for them. So we were not agitating to get things on. What we wanted to do was to get the story out. But I think those two things, one that you pointed out is, and the way each of them handled race relations, and plus the airport, were determining factors.
You did a number of editorials on the civil rights movement. When and how do you decide to do that?
Well, we did these commentaries, they were called, because I couldn't editorialize. I was not the boss. So I did commentaries about them. And there was one of them that just didn't get on the air, as I remember. And that was because they were having a scheduled uprising in an East Georgia town. And I wrote out, what's the recipe for getting trouble erupting in your town? And the recipe is, first of all, that you don't desegregate when you should. And the second one is that you let the rabble-rousers do their thing. And the third is that you cry because the news people come in. Because given the first two items, you're going to get the third. And I showed that to the boss, and he says, "Ray, don't do that. Don't do that, because that's going to aggravate that situation out there." So that was never on the air. But I did some other commentaries that were somewhat similar to that.
Mm-hmm. How did you handle coverage of the freedom rides and the sit-ins?
Well, we were more of the sit-in crowd in Atlanta, for example. The Riches sit-in at the Magnolia Room. What a wonderful name for it to be, Magnolia Room for the sit-ins. And Lonnie King was one of the leaders of the young people's group who were agitating here. And he had his targets, and he knew how to operate them, and he knew how to relate to us in the news media. At one time, I considered waving off our coverage because it did seem as though the black folks knew how to play us like a fiddle. And they'd shout for us. They're going to say, we're going to be here, and we're going to be there, and you be there. So, and we were. And I said, we got to ease up on the throttle here. I never did call the signals on that, but I thought about it.
Let's talk for a minute about President Jimmy Carter.
Well, he was an interesting guy. He had such a mild demeanor in public, and I thought, gosh, that's a marshmallow spine. But I realized subsequently that he had a steel rod in his spine. He was tough, really. And so he moved things around pretty well, and I think, unfortunately, he had a chief of staff who didn't relate very well to the Georgia legislature, which is one of the reasons he wasn't able to accomplish as much as he would have liked with the Georgia legislature. He did some things, of course, but not enough to suit him. Well, anyhow, he let it be known early on when he was still in the governor's mansion to people he would invite in that he was interested in the presidency. And, of course, some of them came away scoffing. And, in fact, there was a lot of, when that became known over Georgia, there was a lot of scoffing about that. And then came some of the times for primary scuffles or whatever. And Jim Axel was the anchor at that time. I had gone on to Shenandoah, the new town, and they invited me back in for political commentary. And Jim says, Ray, do you think Jimmy Carter has a chance of being president? And I said, yes. He said, you do? I said, yes. I said, the reason he does is because of his determination. And I said, he's been all over, and he has won a lot of friends. He set this campaign up, and I think he will be a formidable person because he's got the Christian mafia behind him. And that's going to be a very sensitive and very effective crowd because they were devoted. They were almost worshipful. And that's one of the reasons I felt that he had a decent chance at the presidency. And that was way in advance of anybody else calling that. And so he, as you know, eventually got the nomination and became president. The other story I remember is when he was running against Carl Sanders. I had the two of them on a give and take session, and the idea was that I would have a session with Jimmy and I'd have a session with Carl, and then we'd have remarks at the end, however they wanted to do it. So I noticed that whenever I was questioning Governor Sanders, Jimmy Carter was at my side, giving that steel-eyed glance that he had at Governor Sanders. And when I got a break, I said, would you mind standing over here, please, Governor Carter? And I said, I think you're disturbing him a little bit. And sure enough, afterward, Carl came up and thanked me. He says, Ray, that was bothering me, and I appreciate your waving him off. So, but he was a competitor, I tell you. Whew, boy.
You have interviewed a lot of famous people. Tell us about some of those interviews.
Well, I think Bobby Jones certainly stands out among all the interviews I've done. I grew up in the 1920s, and Bobby Jones was the king. And in the 1930s, I believe it was, he won the Grand Slam, U.S. and British Open, and the amateur, the likewise scene. And so I kind of idolized him. He was somebody I read about in the newspaper as a young man. And then I get to Atlanta, and I figure, hey, there's a guy here named Bobby Jones. If I'm interviewing people, I ought to have him on. So even though he was crippled at the time, I said, I don't know whether I'll get him or not, but I tried. I called him and get him on the phone himself, and he agreed to come out. And at that time, we were not in white columns on Peachtree. We were in a little shed or brick mess in the back, but it had a it had a loading dock, and so Bobby was brought in by a loading dock, wheeled into the main studio, and sat down, and I was agog. I said, here I am sitting here, and here's a hero, a legend. And I was a little tongue-tied, I'm sure. And I did a 5-minute interview, which I still have, but it was not distinguished because I just couldn't get my thoughts together, I guess. But he was one of the real thrilling interviews that I had. Well, let's see.
You once interviewed Attorney General Bobby Kennedy.
Yes, I did. I interviewed Bobby Kennedy in Washington, and we were talking about the way he had handled the problems in Alabama, at the University of Alabama Law School and the like. And he had been the chief advisor to his brother and had probably done a pretty good job of it. And after the half-hour interview, I went away and I says, that guy is just sharp as a tack, but I said, I don't think I know him. It didn't come through. And that leads me to the point where he was assassinated. And I think partly because I was almost immune to feeling by that time with President Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and now here's Bobby Kennedy. And I turned off the emotion engine altogether until the train rolls through all these towns, and I see the train carrying Bobby Kennedy back to Washington, and the crowds standing there in awe, and they had been standing there for so long. And that's the time when I broke. I was moved, and I did an editorial commentary about him.
Somewhere in your career, you decided to change stations.
Yes, I'm not sure I should tell that story.
I sure wish you would.
All right, we'll have a go at it. We had a problem with hang on, don't go away. I'm still tuning in. The wheels are grinding. They need a little lubrication, I think, by now. Oh, dear, dear, dear. Give me a hint. What was the story then?
It was Jones at
Yeah.
the newspaper. Remember, he had run an editorial.
Paul
against
Jones.
you.
Paul Jones. Okay, I got it now. Thank you. Sarah is my memory. So anyhow, the problem is that we had a story about the mafia moving into Georgia from Miami. And we had the guy tagged who was the head representative of the mafia there, eventually bought a big home in North Atlanta. And our Ken Goodnight, who was the investigative reporter for us, had the beat on him very, very solidly. So at the same time, WAGA-TV, TV5, had a story about a youth who was going into stores and buying pornographic material even though he was underage. And that was their story and our story, and coincidentally they ran it the same day. And Paul Jones, he was the writer for the Atlanta Constitution, the TV critic. And he comes out with a story about, here are the TV stations coming at ratings because they have gone for the sex. And and he ranted a little bit about that, that's the way we use to draw in ratings. And it infuriated me. It really, really ticked me off. And so I wrote a response to him that I think cut him up pretty good. Anyhow, he may think differently. We're still friends, by the way. I think he may be gone now, but we kissed and made up. Well, regardless of that, I really wrote a scathing indictment. The point was, he never bothered to call me and say, what are you doing and why are you doing it? Because he didn't know at that time that we had the mafia, which was a very big story. Anyhow, it became a huddle in my office, my little cubicle. And so Frank Gaither, the boss, is there, the big boss, and the attorney for Dow, Lonis, and Albertson is there, and Don Heald is there. It was kind of crowded, but anyhow, they said, Ray, we can't let you do that. We can't let you do it. I said, why not? He says, well, we've gotten into some ratings trouble with the FCC over what Pittsburgh is doing, and they're accused of drumming up ratings, hyping ratings. And we've had to go through an awful lot of paperwork and everything else answering the FCC's complaint about that. And we don't want to jump into that hot kettle again. So they had a valid point. But I had a valid point too. And that was, the Dow Lonis lawyer says, Ray, he says, can't you send a letter to the editor and voice your complaints that way? And I said, no. I said, I can't do that. I'm a TV guy, and TV is my fort, and I'm answering on TV, not in the newspaper, even though we were owned with the same party. And so he also came up with another solution. He says, can't you, Frank, talk to those guys and get them to put a soft pedal on Paul Jones? I said, whoa, wait a minute. I said, I don't want Paul Jones silenced. He ought to be free to write what he wants to, and I ought to be free to speak what I want to. So they said, nope, you can't do it. So I slept on it one night, 2 nights. The third day I got up and says, I got to do it. So I turned in my resignation. And I knew they'd accept it because we didn't quarrel around. Anybody wanted to resign? Get out. So that's what they did. And they had made a good business decision. And I may or may not have made a good TV decision. But I went to sleep okay that night. And the next day I'm unemployed and looking for a job somewhere. And happily, in fact, it was that day, that night, when Don announced my resignation, I got within 5 minutes a call from Bob Brennan, who was the TV news director at Channel 5, and he said, "Ray, we want to talk to you." And at the same time, Channel 11 called and said, "We would like to have lunch with you." So I met with both of them. And Channel 11 offered more money, but they were a poor number 3 at the time. And I decided I'd rather go with TV5 for a little lower cash. Anyhow, that's what happened, and I went to TV5. And I had a good career there, I think.
Yes. Well, let's talk about the Olympics.
Ah, the Olympics, yes. Well, after jumping to a new town next door to Newnan called Shenandoah, I got with Georgia Tech, and I was director of research communications there. And Billy Payne came to Dr. Creasine, who was our president, and he said, "I got an idea. We're going to get in the Olympics for Atlanta." And, he asked Dr. Creasine if he could build a great big wide table whereby they could put the sites for the Olympics down here, there, and everywhere, and say, here's Stone Mountain, and here's Georgia Tech, etc. And Creasine said, no, Billy. He said, "You got it all wrong." He says, "What you need is interactive television." He said, whereby they can sit and punch a button and go where they want to go. Well, that was semi-revolutionary at the time. They had been doing it. But, of course, it fell to the Georgia Tech people to do that. And Mike Sinclair, who was a brilliant guy, he's now at Microsoft, and Fred Dyer was equally adept. And then I got into the circle, and what I did was to write and narrate the interactive television programs. And the way that worked was we hired a Los Angeles film crew, and with that helicopter that stops vibration, I mean, it's smooth ride, they went in all the places where we had venues and filmed them. And so we got all that stuff and put it together, and thereby, sitting at a console with a console here and the picture here, you could move a cursor across the landscape to take you where you wanted to be. And if you wanted to see boxing, you could roll from the Marriott Hotel down North Avenue and come into the boxing ring at Georgia Tech. And it said I had gotten film from NBC of Olympics fighting and all the other venues, all the other past stuff. And so you came down the corridors of the Georgia Tech Coliseum, and wham bam, there you are with the arena in the center, and boy, you see Muhammad Ali in a boxing match that we had stolen from NBC with credits. Anyhow, that's the way we did it. And they would go all the way from Atlanta out to Stone Mountain by cursor, overland, oversea, etc. Well, Fred Dyer got to take that to the first meeting of the IOC. And the IOC had no more idea where Atlanta was. They thought it was a casino, Atlantic City, So many of them did. Not all of them, I'm sure. But anyhow, they needed an education about Atlanta. And here we were making a presentation to the IOC, and Fred was sitting there at the console and manipulating it here. They said, well, we want to go there, we want to go there. And they were flabbergasted. They were just aghast and impressed. And Princess Margaret. I get the princesses mixed up, but Princess Margaret, I think, who's a great horsewoman. Anyhow, Princess Margaret saw that we were going to do a little bit of finagling and blow up a tiny little stretch of land as a part of the Stone Mountain Lake, or whatever it is out there. And she says, "Oh, no, you don't mean blow up Stone Mountain, do you?" And Fred said, "No, ma'am, we're just a little piece of land right here. Get it out so they could have the canoeing or whatever it was," as eventually it was moved elsewhere. But that was the initial plan, to have that water sports at Stone Mountain. Mm-hmm. So she was mollified, I hope. But another point. At the time when this was announced, Sarah and I got to go because it was really a wonderful thing.
This was in London?
No.
Japan, Tokyo.
Tokyo.
Yeah, Tokyo.
Okay.
And so I got to go because we had done a sequel to this thing. And by the way, I was afraid, very greatly afraid, because I thought, my gosh, Athens, who is the favorite, has seen our bit, and they're going to eclipse us. And I went walking through the corridors and got to the exhibit of the Greeks. And thank God, no video. They had the Greek goddesses there, statuesque ladies in the flowing robes, Queen of Sheba or whatever else, and over a rug that was showing Greece, and it was just pedestrian as could be. And I said, "Oh boy, we're safe maybe." So in the presentation, Maynard Jackson and Andrew Young and Billy Payne were the three speakers that were permitted from Atlanta. And you probably know those cats. They are mesmerizing, no question about it.
Right.
And they enthrall the IOC. And so here comes Juan Antonio Samaranch, and it is Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And everybody went to screaming and hollering, and we jumped up and down and all that. We went out in the hall, and the kiddies who were high school kids, theoretically, who might be Olympic contenders in Billy Payne's imagination. And they were jumping up and screaming, howl. And Monica Kaufman grabs Sarah and swings her around, and Maynard Jackson grabs her and twirls her, and we're hooting and hollering, and Princess Margaret wanders up. And all our youth go romping up to Princess Margaret. "Whoa, thank you. She says, "Don't thank me. I voted for Athens."
Oh, my goodness.
The eventual put down.
Yeah.
So that was a great experience. So
One other thing I'd like to talk about, one of your documentaries entitled The Search.
yes. Well, I went to West Point, Georgia, to be with some friends down there, and I was amazed at what went on in what is called a lay witness mission, and that was something that Ben Johnson created, Dr. Ben Johnson, not to be confused with the lawyer, but it was a place where for a weekend laymen come in from outside and they talk to laymen from a particular city and hopefully enthuse them about Christianity and whatever. I could say that Christianity now, I hope. But anyhow, the West Point gals in Ford Motor Company, I remembered his name yesterday, but not today. But anyhow.
Jim Golden.
Huh?
Jim Golden?
No, I wasn't Jim Golden. That was, Jim Golden was with the episode about the whatever. Anyhow, back to the I was enthused about it, and I said, well, you know, this might make good television. And then I got to brooding about it, and I says, well, this might be even better if we could have prime time and have all the ways that Georgians search for God. And we called it The Search. And we got the snake handlers, which was just a tremendous performance. Thank God nobody was killed. And we got the foot washing primitive Baptists, which, by the way, I think was the most moving of the services, because they were elderly people, only one young person there. And they were doing their ritual in their sing-song fashion and washing the feet of their friends. And it was a really moving ceremony. And we got, let's see, the singing in it's the singing that is rhapsodic, and maybe I'll get that sometime. In any case, speaking in tongues. We got speaking in tongues as well. But we meshed that with routine things like a Mass at the First Baptist Church at Atlanta, and also jazz Mass in parts, and we had an Episcopal preacher, Episcopalian layman who was becoming a preacher. He had decided late in life to take up the ministry, and we got his story as well. So I pitched the idea to Don Heald and Gene Hendricks and the crowd at the Cox Committee, and Don says, it's too long, 3.5 hours. And Gene Hendricks, who was the film director, says, it's too bizarre. And so, well, somehow or other they let me do it. So we put it on and called it The Search, and Mills Lane, CNS, Mills Lane. Mills, of course, is famous, for those who don't know him, as a guy who is a take-charge guy, and he is a hell-bent for leather guy, and he is really a stem winder. So Dale Smith, who was the sales manager, told Don, he said, I can't get anybody to buy this thing. And I said, well, let me go see if I can get an audience with Mills Lane. So I took Dale Smith in tow. We went down to Mills Lane's office, and here's old Mills sitting up there with a foot cocked up on the table with white socks on one foot and black socks on the other. And, oh, Ray, what can I do for you? What can I do for you? And I said, well, we got an idea we'd like to show you or talk to you about. And all we did was talk. I talked for maybe 5 minutes. And he turned to Dale and he says, how much is it? And Dale says, well, a quarter sponsorship is so much, but a half hour would be so much. And Mills said, no, what's the whole thing? What's the whole thing? Wow. Dale gave him the price, and he said, I'll take it. So he took it, and stuff flowed into his desk. I mean, he said, I've never done anything in TV that had that kind of reaction. And neither had we, by the way. So we were vindicated in the too long and bizarre. We'd put it at 3.5 hours opposite the ABC and CBS primetime opening segments. You know, they have the premiere shows in September, and NBC didn't have it then, so we got that time. And we knocked them out all across the board.
Great.
I'm bragging.
Yeah, well, you should.
I'm bragging about that.
You've been a very successful person. The state owes you a lot. You're a jewel.
Thank you.
But before we leave, I want to ask you one other question. why did you not accept a position with NBC after having been offered one or maybe two?
Yes, well, after I had done the NBC conventions and the like, Reuben Frank, who is the boss of NBC News at that time, rest his soul, sent an emissary to Atlanta, and we had dinner together, and he said, Reuben would like for you to take John Chancellor's place in Chicago. John is being sent to be chief of the London Bureau. Well, I had seen and admired John a long time. And one of the things that I admired about him was he went to one of the hurricane sites in Louisiana, and he was moved by it, and he showed his movement. He was not the cold, emotionless guy that so many people thought was the way a news person should be, but he showed it, and I loved him for that. So anyhow, I thought about it for at least a day and decided that Chicago is too bloody cold for me. One thing, I had a wind off Lake Michigan. I was serving in Ohio for a while. I knew what it was like in the cold weather. And I said, I like Atlanta, and I think Atlanta would be a better place to raise my children, whom I didn't have, than Chicago would be. So I declined. And later on, I got two other offers, one to be news director in Chicago and the other to be news director in Washington, D.C. For the NBC affiliates. And I just decided I'd stay put. Didn't get rich, but I stayed put, and I got three great guys who have turned out so well.
Well, we're glad you did.
I'm glad I did.
Well, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Bob, for having me. It's a pleasure. And I love UGA because my three sons all went here.
Oh,
Right.
good. That's great.